Support for In the Frame, Exploring the D.I.A. is provided by Masco Corporation Foundation. Masco is a global manufacturer of home improvement and building products.
Hello, and welcome to In the Frame, Exploring the D.I.A. My sister and I, growing up, both wanted to be artists, and in fact, my sister went on to be a professional artist. And I distinctly remember a discussion that we had, probably in our early teens, when my sister had noticed something, and she said to me, "Why are all the artists men?" As if I had the answer. I, of course, had probably never thought about it before. And in the 1970s, the great American scholar Linda Nochlin did an exhibition called "Why Are There No Women Artists?" Well, there are. And of course, over the centuries, they were minimized. They were sometimes actually written out of the history books, as we say. But today, we're going to look at the D.I.A.'s collection and see some of the truly great works of art made by women artists over the centuries. As is very often the case with women artists in earlier centuries, they were part of a family of artists, such as the case with Artemisia Gentileschi, who was the daughter of Orazio Gentileschi. And she worked in her father's studio, but it being her father's studio didn't prevent her being assaulted and raped by a fellow assistant. That particular incident tells us a lot. We have a lot of information about the proceedings of courts and attitudes in society, but it may also, more importantly, account for her choice of subject. The painting behind me, Judith and her maidservant with the head of Holofernes, where she shows a woman who has decapitated an ancient king. There may be some very strong sense of revenge in this subject matter. The Gentileschi's were influenced by an artist called Caravaggio, who pioneered a way of painting that used very strong light and shade, something we commonly refer to as chiaroscuro. And it allowed artists to show off their great skill in showing how things were illuminated and how textures and colors and all that sort of thing was changed by the amount of light hitting it. Here we see the candle that forms the main source of light in this painting, and it streams down across Judith's gown, down to the maidservant who's hastily wrapping up Holofernes' head. Holofernes was the leader of an army that was attacking the Israelites. Judith offered to spend the night with the king, which she did. The king accepted. And when he was asleep, she cut off his head. Of course, this was going to cause tremendous disarray with the Holofernes army and save the Israelites. But you get that sense of this being a secret operation because as Judith holds out her hand, which on the one hand allows the artist to show her great skill in painting flesh and light penetrating through flesh, it also gives a sense of an alert. She's alerting her maidservant that they need to be quiet for a moment because they're doing something dangerous and their getaway might be endangered.
Louise Bourgeois was born in Paris, in France, and lived in a middle-class family. In the 1930s, she met the American critic and art historian Robert Goldwater. They were married and had children in France before they moved to New York. And it's this piece that tells a little bit of the story of that move to America and her ideas of a woman's situation in the late 40s. You'll notice the way this is actually made. Along the bottom, you see how some of the legs actually hit the ground, or the horizon line, and others are up from the line. And this gives a sense of movement. But this is quite a searing critique about women in New York, women in general in the late 1940s. Because you notice that all of these women are hooked together and that they have to move as one, just as if they were a centipede. If one leg moves, all legs move. This is part of Bourgeois' perspective, that women were actually very confined to what they could do. Now, another thing that Bourgeois is doing that is unusual at the time is that this wood structure isn't painted. Instead, it's stained. It's stained with pink, purple, and black inks. Louise is trying to, at this point, pull away from what the traditional art structures are. She's not using finely carved or milled wood. She's using unique idiosyncratic shapes, and she's using idiosyncratic colors and non-traditional pigments. She's beginning to assert herself to develop her own voice as an artist. And at this point, I should say that Louise Bourgeois is still alive and working today. She is considered the grandmother of all feminists, so that this is a very early statement. And if you travel the US, you're likely to see Louise Bourgeois' work throughout many major museums in a more mature form.
Edmonia Lewis was the first African-American sculptor to achieve national and international recognition. She was born in upstate New York. Her mother was a Chippewa Indian, and her father was a free black man. She eventually was able to attend Oberlin College, where she first studied art. Then in 1863, she moved to Boston, where she was able to study with a neoclassical portrait sculptor. She did enjoy the patronage of quite a number of white and black abolitionist collectors, which helped her tremendously with her career. In 1865, Lewis traveled to Rome from Boston, and in Rome she set up her own studio. Eventually, she joined a colony of American artists working there. This colony of artists attracted the tourist trade from America and Europe, and Edmonia Lewis benefited from that as well. As far as we know, she spent the rest of her life and career in Rome, although there's still more scholarship needed to be done on Edmonia Lewis. Minnehaha is just one of about 5 sculptures by Lewis that demonstrate her interest in Native American culture. These sculptures were inspired by her reading of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha, which was published in 1855. The poem was very popular at the time. I think a lot of times we forget that poetry in the 19th century was about as popular then as rap music or rock music is for us today. Many artists were influenced by poetry at the time. But besides her interest in her Native American heritage, she also was strongly proud of her African American heritage and did a number of sculptures that demonstrate interest and concern of hers. Mainly, she's particularly noted for using the neoclassical approach to art, which is about the influence of the art of ancient Rome on art at that time when Edmonia Lewis was working. She used that style in a way that was very unique, and that she used it to elevate marginalized African Americans and Native Americans to a status that was typical of classical themes in Western sculpture. Next to the Minnehaha on view in the museum's gallery for 19th century African American art, you'll see the portrait bust of Hiawatha, which is the companion piece to the Minnehaha. But the Hiawatha portrait bust is on loan from the Manugian collection, and we're very happy to have it here.
The Dutch Golden Age of painting lasted for the first 3/4 of the 17th century, and it ended with surprising abruptness after the wealth of artists such as Vermeer, Rembrandt, Frans Hals, many other less well-known artists. This sudden flood of paintings didn't exactly cease, but it lost its originality. There are just a few exceptions to this, artists who worked into the 18th century, well into the 18th century, and perhaps the best two were both flower painters. And one of those flower painters was Rachel Ruysch, who did the painting that you see behind me. Rachel Ruysch was born to a scientist, Frederick Ruysch, who became a professor of anatomy in Amsterdam, and she moved there with her father when she was just a little girl. I like to think that perhaps it's being around her father, who was a botanist also, that she saw from a very early age delicate drawings of plants, and that this may have inspired her. But she went on to study as a serious artist and was admitted to the Guild, just like any other artist of the period. She worked in Amsterdam until she was invited to Dusseldorf by the Elector Palatine, where she went to work for him until 1716, when she returned to Amsterdam. She had a prodigious career, producing a long, long line of exquisite paintings, every one as good as the last one. She lasted into her 80s, and somewhere in the middle of all of this business that she was doing, she found the time to have 10 children. Jan van Huysum and Rachel Ruysch took flower painting to new heights. If you come into the D.I.A. and look at some of our earlier flower paintings, you will see that they are very tightly focused, and that you can basically see the outline of the whole bunch, and you can see very clearly delineated whatever vessel is holding them. But when you look at the 18th century paintings, flower paintings by Van Huysum and Rachel Ruysch, you get a very different sense. Everything has a kind of a lightness to it, and it tends to fill the whole frame. It's not just completely compact in the middle of the picture. It spreads out. You don't really see the edges, and you have, interestingly, a sort of sense of moisture, an atmosphere around the pictures. And you see here in the works of art, in these flowers here, flowers taken from all the seasons. This is not a picture of things that were plucked from the garden at a particular moment and then painted. But you see woven through all of these things. You see the vines creeping, and you see the insects crawling, and the moths around it. Really a very complex structure. And although these terms are rather dangerous, it does have a kind of rococo lightness. It turns away from the very heavy solidity spiral forms that you get in earlier Baroque painting, and has this refreshing sort of lightness to it.
This painting by Elizabeth Murray, L'Amour, Panic for DJ, was made about 40 years after Louise Bourgeois created her Blind Leading the Blind. Elizabeth Murray is another feminist artist who also lived in New York. In 1982, she was married to the poet Bob Holman, and together they had 2 children. So Elizabeth found herself in her mid-40s as the mother of 2 young children, in addition to being the mother of another son who was born many years earlier. This particular piece tells a little bit about the story of her domestic life. Her husband, Bob Holman, as I said, was a poet, and when he appeared on stage, he always had a small lapel pin on his suit, and his stage that was in the shape of a question mark, and his stage name is Panic DJ, thus the title, Amour for Panic DJ. This painting consists of 3 intertwined question marks. Elizabeth Murray, before she makes a painting like this, does a lot of drawing, and eventually makes a small clay model, which is sent out to a woodworker to make the structure or the support for her painting, and then canvas is stretched over it. Now, the format, the 3 question marks, come directly from that lapel pin that her husband wears when he performs. And in this particular piece, I believe that Elizabeth Murray is asking questions about domestic life and about her career. At this point, she is a mother of 3. She has 2 very small children. She's in her late 40s. And in the late 1980s, this piece was made in '86, her career is beginning to take off. You'll notice that the question marks are intertwined and they tumble one over the other. It's as if somebody has questions about where they're going, who they are, what their life's going to be like, that are just turning over and over in their heads. And there's something else that I find particularly compelling about this piece. It's the square, or this rough rectangular shape in the center. This relates to a series of works that Murray does about tables, and specifically about the kitchen table as the site for family interaction. as the site for domestic living. You know, think about it. You sit around your table, you read the paper, you have daily conversations there. And so this is as if Elizabeth is telling us something about the conversations she's having. Now, on the painting itself, you'll notice that in addition to the table, there are these vein-like lines that go throughout it. Perhaps they are actual veins of her body. She's asking questions about her actual existence, but they have also been interpreted as fallopian tubes. As a woman in her late 40s with very young children, she no doubt would be asking herself questions about how large a family she'd want and how to continue her very demanding professional life and be a good mother.
As you move through the 20th century, women artists become less and less of a rarity. You progress into the 50s and 60s with Lee Krasner, Helen Frankenthaler, followed by artists such as Eva Hesse and Jackie Windsor. Still something of a minority, but very much making their mark. But there's no doubt that the great icon of women artists in American 20th century art was Georgia O'Keeffe. She was a remarkable woman, very, very strong-minded and independent, and she lived to be almost 100. Her career started when she was a young woman in New York and associated with the Stieglitz Circle, but her real breakthrough came when she was actually teaching in a very lonely position in Texas, where almost independently she developed an almost pure abstraction based on landscape. She took that abstraction and worked with it throughout her life until she moved to New Mexico and spent many decades there painting the work for which she's perhaps most famous. But some of us think that her earlier work was in fact more demanding, and I have a little scene behind me here, Lake George, Barnes, that was done in 1932, when all of what we were to think of as being Georgia O'Keeffe was already in play. A remarkably austere work when you put this alongside the work of individuals like Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton. She was, as I said earlier, a quite remarkable woman, and she retained that independence right up until the very end.
For over 40 years, Betty Saar has specialized in assemblage art. She does this through the construction of found objects which are linked together to create a whole work of art. Her talent is also admired for her distinct ability to develop an aesthetic that reflects her knowledge of African American culture and history. She very much appreciates the richness and complexity of African American culture, and that is shown in her work. She also is known for using symbols in her art that refer to her interest in aspects of the occult, as well as her desire to challenge myths about race and gender. Beyond Midnight, Magie Noire is a recent example of Betty Saar's assemblage art. In it, we see the portrait of an African American woman at the center of the composition of the assemblage. And she is surrounded by divining sticks. Also over her face, there is a mesh-like fabric that refers to the wives' tales, the notion of certain wives' tales regarding the story of when a child is born with a veil or a caul over its face. It indicates that the child is gifted with spiritual powers. The portrait of the woman at the center is surrounded by a lacy sky filled with stars and crescent-shaped moons. At the lower right of the frame, we see a bunch of keys which symbolize the idea that the woman at the center, who is a ritual healer or, someone very spiritual, that these keys are to unlock the mystery of her talents as a ritual healer. An obvious feature attached to the frame is a metal upraised hand. This is a symbol that's usually used to convey a blessing or ritual healing. What's really amazing is how Betty actually finds all these objects at flea markets and is able to eventually combine them in works of art. Of course, a lot of this is not even pre-planned when she buys these things. But the other side of this work of art has to do with Betty Saar's critique of African Americans hang up about skin color. This problem is the result of slavery as well as plantation politics. What Betty is concerned about is that it still goes on. The Assemblage Beyond Midnight, Magie Noire, was one of her new works that she presented in 2002, along with several other works having to do with this issue of skin color. What makes this really important is that this is a subject that at one time African American artists wouldn't touch at all. It would really have been considered taboo. But Betty, as a contemporary artist, is able to do that because the thinking about art and the thinking about these issues within African American culture are very different today, and so the climate is right for her to focus on this subject.
As well as changing the course of art, a number of early modern movements had the revolutionary aim of changing society. And part of that change was a modicum of feminism. And that modicum of feminism translated into a number of women artists being associated with these movements. A number, still a very, very small minority, except perhaps in Russia, what became the Soviet Union, where women played a really rather significant part. This painting is by Paula Modest-Becker, who was associated with the German Expressionists. They wanted to get back to simplicity, to straightforwardness, and they wanted to use bright color and dark lines, very, very bold shapes. And you can see that that's what Paula Modest-Becker is doing here. She's created this very, very striking image with the contrast of the bright greenish yellow in the background and the blue of this woman's outfit setting off the hands that are run across her heart, mimicking the gesture of the Virgin in the Annunciation that you can see elsewhere in this museum of our Fra Angelico. But it shows a very humble, a very sweet picture of a woman being very submissive and done, as I say, with tremendous simplicity, and just this little touch of the flower down at the bottom, the little bit of yellow and brown that really sets off that greenish blue. Modest-Becker went off to a tremendous start, but unfortunately her career was cut short by a peril that encountered by no male artists. She died in childbirth, aged 31.
Well, I grew up in Detroit, and the D.I.A. was not very far from where we lived. And so as a young child, family brought my brother and myself here. And then eventually, as I got older, I became a member as an adult, and that's been for over 30-some years. I go to a lot of museums around the country, and as a Detroiter, we have that Detroit thing in our mind, which is how do we compare or don't compare? And I've been to the Met, Boston's museum, Chicago, California, all over. And somehow, in my mind, I keep making the comparison that's changed the whole idea around of how we think as Detroiters. I keep making comparison and say, our collections, by and large, American, European, African American, contemporary, are far larger, deeper, and wider than I find in many of these others. And I find that the D.I.A. in this particular situation across the board offers a higher level of viewing for the visitor.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of In the Frame, looking at the work of traditionally overlooked women artists, and I invite you to come down and look for yourself. For a full listing of programs, go to dia.org. Until next time, this is Graham Beale, your guide to one of America's great museums, the Detroit Institute of Arts.
Support for In the Frame, Exploring the D.I.A. is provided by Masco Corporation Foundation. Masco is a global manufacturer of home improvement and building products. An encore presentation of In the Frame is available on demand for viewing at DetroitPublicTV.org.